Have you ever heard of restorative practices and wondered, what does that mean? Have you heard of restorative practices and thought, there's too much that I would have to do to even be able to use restorative practices in my classroom? Have you found yourself in class with your students and they feel or seem like they're not engaged or not really participating? Well, if you can relate to any of those statements that I just said, I would love for you to stay right here with me for the next 15-20 minutes, as I'm going to talk with you about some ways that restorative practices can be used that aligns with what you do already in your classroom on a daily basis. So imagine the hustle and bustle of the hallways in a high school that I'm new to. I can remember a time when I had to start off with using these practices with students who did not know me. There was a time I was in the hall, the bell was about to ring. At this time, students needed to be in their class. There was a young man that I noticed that was casually walking down the hall while looking at his phone. And I said to the young man, "Hey, you want to hurry up and get to class? That bell just rung." He took a pause and looked up at me and then continued walking in the same fashion. Another day had come. I saw that same young man in the hallway. I went up to him and I said, "Hello, I'm Miss Perry Finch. What's your name?" He said his name was Jonathan. "How's your day going, Jonathan?" "It's going pretty good." "Wonderful. I hope it keeps going that way. Now you might want to hurry up and go ahead and get to class so you can get those A's." And days continue to go like this, and I continue to talk with Jonathan. And the more that I talk with him, the more Jonathan talks with me. He tells me how he's going to be trying out for the basketball team. He tells me how he had a hard time sleeping last night and it was hard for him to get up and get to school on time. These are the kind of things that build those relationships that we need. Interestingly now, when I talk with Jonathan about him getting to that class on time, he walks in a faster pace. He makes sure that he's getting there. He comes and tells me how he did well on the test that he took. So I share these stories with you to continue to encourage you. Don't give up. Continue to use these practices to build those relationships, because in the end, you can see the benefits of the work that you are doing, and you can see it in our students as they have another person that they can be safe with on their journey to adulthood. The information that you're going to get in this video is merely an overview of what restorative practices is. Really, to learn more about restorative practices and how to use these practices, training is a must. What is restorative practices? It's really a framework. It's a way of being. It's a way of valuing people on purpose, valuing relationships, valuing yourself in relationship to others. When we think about restorative practices, this term truly stemmed from the term restorative justice, and restorative justice stemmed out of the justice system. In that system, we recognize that when people committed crimes, there were legal ramifications for committing those crimes. But did those legal ramifications truly repair the harm that was done in those acts? And so they considered using these practices to bring a person who had caused harm together with a person who had been harmed to have some dialogue to truly repair the relationships that had been harmed by that act. Schools in the 90s started to adopt these practices, and circles are the most common form of restorative practices. Hence, there's a shift in the term because we are not the justice system in considering the term restorative practices. What are things that we can do in our schools to restore relationships in our buildings? So when we think about that, if you can envision a continuum that you'll be seeing in this time, when you're looking at this continuum where you're going from these informal to formal ways of using restorative practices, as you go from informal to formal ways of using these practices, two things are happening. It takes more time and it takes more expertise. For example, one of the most informal ways of using restorative practices is using an affective statement. An affective statement is merely telling someone how you feel about something. "I feel frustrated when you're talking in class while I'm talking." "I'm so excited to see that you are here today." When we use those affective statements, it's really considering that framework that we're coming from and thinking about when I tell someone how I feel about something that they're doing, I'm actually thinking that they're worthy of hearing how I feel because it takes a little bit of vulnerability for me to share how I feel. I'm saying that that person is valuable enough to hear that. I'm thinking that that person is wise enough to understand what I'm saying, and that that person cares enough about my feelings to be able to respond to that in a caring way. So again, it's this opportunity to also teach these social and emotional learning skills. When we talk about social and emotional learning, we talk about relationship skills, we talk about self-awareness and social awareness, responsible decision making. And in our social interactions with people on a daily basis, we have these opportunity to practice those social and emotional learning skills. And restorative practices is one way of helping us practice on a daily basis. As we move through that continuum, the next phase of that would be using an affective question. An affective question could be as simple as saying, I noticed that you've been sleeping more in class today. What brought about the change? Now, the reason that that takes more time is because we have to wait for an answer when we ask a question. But in so doing, this is another way of building a relationship with that student, as opposed to saying, hey, wake up. Hey, no sleeping in class. I noticed that you're sleeping in class. What brought about the change? Is everything okay? And again, having this dialogue with a student that helps build that relationship. Because when we have those kind of relationships with our students, then they're more apt to do what we need them to do for their academic and social success. As we move to the next phase of that continuum, we begin to talk about having small impromptu conferences. And a small impromptu conference is a series of questions that we may ask a student who has either been harmed or who has caused harm. If a student has caused harm or been harmed, there's one question that we ask no matter what, and that's what happened. As you look at these series of questions, I invite you to practice. Think about a situation that you are in where you could practice using these questions in this format and see how that works out for you versus some traditional ways, maybe more punitive ways of addressing a situation, especially when we're talking to a student who has been harmed. And one thing that I have found to be very interesting is that when we have these dialogues with students, sometimes we find out that the person that we saw got harm maybe also caused some harm. And also thinking about, though, as human beings, we all do things that go well for us sometimes and that don't go so well sometimes. And so thinking about the holistic human being is another way of thinking about what does it mean to be restorative with our students. Knowing that our students will make mistakes just like we do, just like we see our parents do. But at the end of the day, we all want to be successful in what we are doing, and we all are valuable and needed to be in that space. As we move to the next phase in that continuum, we're talking about the circle process, which again is the most common form of restorative practices, is when we're actually sitting in circle. But it's not just sitting in circle. It's not the circle that makes it restorative, the act of actually sitting that way, but it's how are we being with one another when we're sitting in that space. Does everyone feel valued? Does everyone have an opportunity to be heard? Is everyone participating in that space and bringing their authentic self? Because these are the kind of things that should be happening when we're having a restorative circle. One example of what it's not. I remember sitting in a circle in an 8th grade classroom. There was a social worker who was facilitating that circle, and there was a teacher who was in the circle with them. The teacher was just beginning to learn what restorative practices is. As the circle continued, there were 2 young men who were talking with each other a bit on the side, not listening to what their other classmates were saying. And this teacher said to the students, hey, you need to stop talking right now. Do you see what you're doing to the rest of the people who are here? You are not being respectful to them. Do I need to call your parents and talk to them about your behavior? You know, if you continue this behavior, that you do not have to be in this program, as it was a summer program. I could see the two young men go into a place of shame as their heads went down. They were no longer smiling and looking a bit sad and embarrassed. What I understand to be happening in that moment to me is that this teacher was trying to manage behavior. She was trying to get these students to do what they needed to do to be present in that space. Some restorative ways of handling that, though, so the students are not embarrassed and don't feel shameful, which can lead to being toxic if there's too much of it, is to talk with those students and remind them of those shared agreements that are in that space. Because when you have a restorative circle, that is a key component of that space. Some typical shared agreements that I use is to listen with respect, speak with respect, assume good intentions, and maintain confidentiality. And when we're in a restorative circle, these are things that the participants have agreed to abide by in their time together before we even got started. Another thing that we could do in a restorative way is talking with the students outside of the circle. John and Jim, can I talk with you for a second outside the circle? I notice that you're doing more talking instead of listening. What's going on? What's causing that? I need you to come into that circle and listen to your classmates. I can't do this by myself. Showing that bit of vulnerability helps the students recognize that they are needed, that they are valued, that they are wanted, and that you know that they can show a better behavior that will help that circle function the way it needs to. So again, everyone feels safe, valued, and supported as you learn. When we think about these circles too, also thinking about those lesson plans that you have. Because this does not have to be a circle that's around a totally different subject that does not relate to what you do every day. As a matter of fact, I would discourage you from doing that. Instead, I would encourage you to take that lesson plan that you have, taking a look at what are those guiding questions, what are those teaching and learning objectives that you already have in your lesson plan, and consider what kind of questions can you ask as you're sitting in a circle. Imagine you're in math class. You've given a lesson on fractions. Now you've given students some problems to solve in class. Could you assign a few problems to a group of students, maybe 2 or 3 students for them to work on? Could you imagine everyone coming back to circle after they've worked through those problems and sharing out what their answers were? Sharing out how it felt to work as a team as they were trying to figure out how to solve these problems. What is something that they learned as they were trying to solve that problem? In this way, we're able to learn about the academic piece of learning how to work through fractions, but we're also learning about those social and emotional learning aspects that happen in a classroom every day. And we're putting those words out there in that circle process for each person to hear from one another. And it's also helpful to us as for those of us who are teachers, because we get a gauge on where our students are at as we're listening to them. We learn more about their needs and where they are. Imagine being in a foreign language class, Spanish, and you have opportunities to practice talking with one another in Spanish. Maybe you do a circle go around and say, Me llamo Shana, as you're in those beginning phases. Imagine all of the things that you could do with using that circle process for students to talk with one another in that foreign language based on where you are in your lesson plans. There are a variety of ways that you could take this circle process and build it into what you do on a daily basis in the curriculums that you have already worked so hard on putting together. Envision the circle in that agenda. Where does it fit? So I have to honestly share with you that I'm just a human being like everyone else. I'm not always restorative, but I try to be. And one thing that I have truly learned in my personal and my professional life is when I come from a restorative lens, I get far better trackway with trying to help a student or a parent or a colleague or myself when I do. One example that's really near and dear to me is a young man who has special education needs. I had noticed him in the hallway. When he would be walking down the hall, there would be a young man there, and he would kind of jump at him, intimidating him. And the young man would jump back as if he was startled and felt unsafe and scared. So one day, I have this in my mind already. I go into his classroom. Unbeknownst to me, he's in that class as I'm going to talk with the teacher. And I see him just get up and walk out of class. I go out into the hallway and I say, "Hey, come back into this classroom. You got to be in here." He looks at me and he continues going the other way. "No, you got to come back in here. Get into this class. You got to get in here right now." Instead, he gets on the floor. So what I learned in that instant is that I did not make things better. I made things worse. And that I was not coming from a restorative lens. One day I saw this young man in the hallway sitting in the corner. Instead of going up to him and saying, "Hey, why aren't you in class? It's time to go to class," I walked up to him and I said, "I want to apologize to you. Is it okay if I apologize right now?" And he shook his head yes. I sat down on the floor with him. I said, "You remember that day that I went into your classroom and you walked out and I was telling you to go back in class? I want to apologize to you because I feel like that the way that I talk with you wasn't a good way to talk with you. Do you accept my apology?" He said yes. And I asked, "Why are you sitting in the hallway?" And he shared he has art class right now and he can't draw well. He continued to share with me how he has a sister at home who draws really well, but he can't. And he doesn't feel comfortable being in a class when he can't draw. I asked him if he tried drawing. He said, "Well, I tried a bit at home, but they're just going to laugh at me if I try drawing in there." I asked, "Do you like to color?" He said yes. I said, "Well, how about if you come to my office? I have a coloring book. You could tear some pages out of it. They're adult coloring books, and you can take them back to the class and draw." He said, "Okay." So he came to my office. He looked through my mindful coloring books. He found a couple of pages that he liked. We got them out. And what the funny part was, I said, "Well, I don't have any colored pencils." He said, "Well, how are you going to have coloring books and you don't have any colored pencils?" And I just laughed. And then he walked on back to class. So I share these stories with you, one, to say that we're all trying as educators. We work hard every day. And when we're using these practices, remember how important it is for you to use these practices for yourself. Be gentle with yourself. You're going to try. It's not always going to work the way you plan, but you have opportunities to fix it. You come back and you try again, because that's what we do. When we think about using these practices, it's not just about using these practices with our students. These practices can also be helpful for us. I remember a time when I was the restorative practices coordinator for a district, and I was called to come and support a school where the staff were in conflict with one another. And let me say that conflict is normal. It's something that we all deal with. And it's nice to have practices and a framework like this that helps us have healthy ways of dealing with that conflict. Also, when I went into that school, I met with the principal and the psychologist and social worker that contacted me to come in. And we put a plan together for how we were going to bring the staff together. And that's really important, that when you're dealing with conflict, especially in a place that you're not as familiar with, that you work with the people around you to decide how are you going to move forward in bridging the gaps that are negatively impacting that culture so that everyone feels valued and supported. Before we even sat in circle, we came up with this idea of doing a survey and collecting data from the survey to really understand where were people, how were they feeling individually, what kind of concerns did they have, how were they feeling about the culture. I remember saying that I was going to compile all this survey data and that we would present it to staff in circle to start our conversation. And some of the staff in that building said to me, "Well, some don't feel comfortable with sharing. They're concerned about if they get identified." That's just how the culture had got in that school. So I asked them, go and talk to your colleagues, see what they're thinking, ask them their opinion. I share these specific, intricate details with you because this is all a part of operating from that restorative lens. There's a lot that we do before we even sit in circle, especially when we're talking about a situation where harm has occurred. So, based on the information that they gathered, we needed to summarize. When we sat in that circle, that is still one of the most powerful circles that I have ever sat in my years with restorative practices. Each person in that circle, they listened to one another. They honestly shared their thoughts and concerns. And one story that really stood out for me was a teacher when she got the talking piece. And she shared that when a safety person comes into her room, they come in, they take a student, and they leave. They don't say anything to her. And she felt disrespected by that. She wanted that safety person to come and say something to her. Why are you taking the student? When will the student return? At the very least. As that talking piece continued going around that circle, the safety person got that talking piece. And she shared that she considered herself being respectful by walking into that classroom, getting the student that she needed right away and getting out, as to not be disruptive to the teacher who was teaching and the students that were in there learning. So I share that to say that sometimes in our conflict, we can find ourselves considering being respectful, and others may find it disrespectful. And it takes us being able to talk with one another to be able to resolve any conflict that may arise. And it takes us trusting that we have the best of intentions in mind and seeing where that guides us in our discussion. So we've talked about what restorative practices is. We've talked about how it stemmed from the term restorative justice. We've talked about a variety of ways that we could use these practices, from affective statements, affective questions, small impromptu conferences, and circles. Remember that this video is really just an overview of how these practices can be used. Training is necessary in order to implement these practices with fidelity. To be able to sit in a space and learn, what does it truly mean to be restorative? What does that framework look like? What does it sound like and look like for you to have this high level of accountability and this high level of support, which is the combining words that bring us to being restorative? So I encourage you to reach out to your administration, to reach out to your colleagues. Feel free to reach out to me and learn about different resources that are out there that you can use so that you can be properly trained in implementing these practices. So hopefully by now you've learned that there are some simple ways that you could use these practices in your classrooms when it comes to ways that you have restorative conversations with your students, when it comes to ways that you have a curriculum that's already set up, but you're sitting in circle as you're teaching that very curriculum, which you can also incorporate those questions that you already have that every student has an opportunity to answer, that helps students become more engaged and participating as they're talking with their peers and with their teacher. And hopefully by now you know that restorative practices is a framework that you are going to make a part of who you are and find these simple ways of integrating this practice purposefully when you're having conversations with your colleagues, with yourself, with your parents, and with your students.